7 hours. Think about that. Not a lifetime, not a generation, not even a full campaign season. 7 hours. That's all it took for one gray-haired, 60-year-old Roman to systematically dismantle and erase 2 centuries of Macedonian military swagger, parking Rome's imperial ambitions squarely on the doorstep of the Eastern Mediterranean. It happened in a single brutal afternoon. It was orchestrated by one general, and it all hinged on one decisive call that turned the mighty phalanx, the formation that had conquered the known world under Alexander the Great, into a frantic, stumbling hedgehog, tripping over its own 5-meter-long spikes. The man at the center of this storm was Lucius Aemilius Paulus. The stage for his masterpiece was a dusty, broken plain near a town called Pydna on the 22nd of June, 168 BCE. And the twist, the detail that makes this more than just a battle, is that he fought this fight with the ghost of his own father watching over his shoulder, because the old man, a consul of Rome, had gone down in flames during the Republic's most humiliating, soul-crushing military catastrophe. Today, we're not just recounting a battle. We are tailing Lucius Aemilius Paulus as he takes a festering family curse, a legacy of catastrophic failure, and flips it into the most lopsided and consequential victory Rome had ever seen. This is the story of how one man's obsession with redeeming his family's honor changed the course of Western civilization forever. Ready? Let's roll. Chapter 1. The Ghost in the Room. Paulus was born into the Aemili, one of those ancient patrician clans that could trace its roots back to the mythic kings of Rome, a lineage steeped in honor and public service. But the story that truly defined him, the shadow that stretched over his entire life, wasn't some heroic myth. It was a raw, recent wound, a national trauma that had occurred just 28 years before he took command in Macedon. In 216 BCE, at a place called Cannae, his father, another Lucius Aemilius Paulus, was one of the 2 consuls in command when Hannibal Barca, the Carthaginian nightmare, sprung the most perfect tactical trap in military history. The elder Paulus had argued against fighting on that flat open ground, sensing Hannibal's intent. But his consular colleague, the impetuous Gaius Terentius Varro, insisted. The result was a slaughter of unimaginable scale. Hannibal's smaller army enveloped and systematically annihilated a Roman force of perhaps 80,000 men. The legions, the backbone of Rome, were not just defeated. They were obliterated. The elder Paulus, refusing to flee, died on the field, fighting to the last. His blood, along with that of senators, knights, and tens of thousands of soldiers, soaked into the dirt. For Rome, it was an existential crisis. For the Aemilius family, it was a stain of failure that could never be washed away. Young Paulus grew up in a world where his name was inextricably linked to that disaster. Imagine the dinner table whispers at other aristocratic houses, the sidelong glances in the forum. An Aemilius. Yes, like the one at Cannae. For a Roman noble whose entire identity was built on virtus, valor, excellence, and success, this was a life sentence of suspicion. The unspoken accusation was that the Aemili couldn't close a fight, that they lacked the killer instinct, that they presided over failure. He answered this accusation the way so many ambitious children of sullied legacies do, with a relentless, almost obsessive pursuit of perfection. He cultivated a personality of stern discipline, unbending integrity, and an absolute allergy to second place. He wasn't just going to be a good soldier. He was going to be the platonic ideal of a Roman commander. He threw himself into the grinding, unglamorous work of expanding and securing the Republic's frontiers. He served with distinction in a series of brutal campaigns in Spain against the fierce Celtiberian tribes, learning how to fight an unconventional enemy in rugged terrain. He battled the Ligurian tribes in the treacherous mountains of northern Italy, honing his skills in logistics and small unit tactics. Each campaign was another brick, carefully and precisely mortared into the wall he was building between himself and his father's ghost. He was methodical, cautious, and utterly ruthless when necessary. He mastered the Roman way of war, not through flashy genius, but through painstaking repetition and an unyielding demand for discipline in his men and himself. By the time the Senate, desperate for a steady hand to solve the Macedonian problem, handed him the command in 168 BCE, he was 60 years old. He was a grandfather, with silver hair and a stern, weathered face. He was not a man who gambled. He was a man who engineered victories. And more than anything, he was a man who was allergic to defeat. Chapter 2. Macedon, the final boss. To understand the stakes, we need to do a quick zoom out. This wasn't Rome's first rodeo with the Kingdom of Macedon. The Republic had already fought and won 2 major wars against them. After the second, they had humbled King Philip V, Alexander the Great's successor, but had left his kingdom mostly intact. Why? Because Rome saw Macedon as a useful buffer state against other powers further east, and frankly, dealing with a Hellenistic kingdom was a complex political headache. The prevailing wisdom was, let's be honest, that a wall of 5-meter pikes is still a formidable deterrent on flat ground. But Philip's son and heir, King Perseus, was not content to be Rome's tamed watchdog. He was ambitious, charismatic, and had inherited his father's deep-seated resentment of Roman arrogance. Over the years, he had quietly and methodically rebuilt Macedonian power. He refilled the national treasury, hoarding enough silver to fund an army for a decade. He reopened the gold mines. He drilled the phalanx relentlessly, restoring its discipline and morale. He bolstered his forces with elite Thracian mercenaries and a formidable contingent of heavy cavalry, including his personal royal squadron. He even added a small but psychologically potent corps of war elephants. Perseus's plan was simple and classic. Leverage Macedonian strength. He would find a way to force the decisive battle onto a wide, flat plain, just like Alexander had at Gaugamela. There, the unbroken wall of Sarissa points would be unstoppable, and his superior cavalry could shatter the Roman wings. He began making alliances, sending diplomatic feelers to Rome's wavering allies in Greece, and presenting himself as the champion of Greek freedom against the encroaching power of the barbarians from Italy. The Senate in Rome was getting extremely jumpy. The war had been dragging on for 3 years with a series of incompetent or unlucky Roman commanders failing to make any headway. Rome's Greek allies, like the Kingdom of Pergamon, were panicking, fearing they'd be left to face a resurgent Macedon alone. Another Roman loss, or even a stalemate, could be enough to flip the entire Greek world into Perseus's camp, creating a massive anti-Roman coalition. The stakes for Paulus were therefore absolute. This wasn't a mission where a respectable treaty would suffice. He had to win. He had to win big. Or he shouldn't bother coming home. Chapter 3, the Chessboard. When Paulus arrived in Greece and took command of the army, he found about 25,000 men and a tactical migraine. The problem was Perseus. The Macedonian king wasn't a fool. He had chosen his ground perfectly. His army was encamped in a virtually unassailable position behind the Elpius River, with the towering Mount Olympus on one side and the sea on the other. The riverbanks were steep, and his phalanx was parked on the far side, bristling with pikes and supported by cavalry. A frontal assault would be a glorious, bloody, and utterly predictable suicide mission. The legions would be cut to pieces before they ever reached the bank. Paulus knew he couldn't go through, so he had to go around. He needed to make Perseus budge, to lure the king away from his fortress and onto ground of Paulus's own choosing. So he fell back on one of the oldest cons in the warfare playbook. Create a convincing diversion. Make your enemy look one way while you move the other. He spent days making a great show of trying to force a crossing at the river's mouth, near the sea. He brought up his soldiers and engaged in pointless skirmishes, all designed to fix Perseus's attention. While this was happening, he dispatched a small, hand-picked column of 8,000 men under one of his most trusted officers, Publius Cornelius Scipio Nasica. a man whose name would also echo through Roman history. Their mission was to undertake a long, secret march inland, circle around the base of Mount Olympus, and come down behind the Macedonian lines. To sell the deception, Paulus staged another noisy demonstration. He sent a separate detachment upriver, ordering them to make as much noise as possible, clanging shields and yelling as if they were trying to hunt for a ford. It was a classic piece of misdirection. Perseus's scouts reported the activity, and the king, believing the main flanking attempt was coming from that direction, shifted some of his forces to counter it. He bit. Meanwhile, Scipio Nasica's column, guided by local merchants who knew the paths, marched through the night. They surprised and routed a small Macedonian outpost, and suddenly Perseus realized his impregnable position was about to be flanked for real. He had no choice but to abandon his camp and fall back south to protect his lines of communication. This was the moment Paulus had been waiting for. As Perseus hastily marched south, Paulus immediately broke camp and shadowed him, pushing his legions hard. A chance skirmish between foraging parties escalated, and suddenly both armies found themselves deploying for battle on the only suitable ground available, the broken, vineyard-pocked plain near Pydna. Paulus had his battle. He had pulled the king off his mountain and onto a chessboard that was far from perfect for a phalanx. Game on. Chapter 4. The Battlefield Breakdown. The morning of June 22nd dawned hot and clear. The air was thick with humidity, the ground underfoot was lumpy and uneven, and the Mediterranean sun was already cranky. This wasn't the perfectly flat parade ground of Perseus's dreams. It was agricultural land, sliced by small gullies, dotted with ancient tombstones, and tangled with vineyards. Every dip in the terrain, every obstacle, was a potential pike trap. Perseus, committed now, slammed his phalanx into formation. He deployed it in a massive, terrifying block, possibly doubling its normal depth to give it more weight and pushing power. It was a solid mass of men and metal, 30 to 40,000 strong, a forest of pikes sticking out like the quills of a metallic porcupine. On the wings, he placed his elite cavalry, his Thracian mercenaries, and his light infantry ready to exploit any break in the Roman line. Paulus, calm and methodical, arranged his own army. He knew a head-on charge against the phalanx was still a losing proposition. His strategy relied on flexibility and opportunism. He put his allied troops out front, Thracian and Pergamene skirmishers, light infantry with javelins and slings, to act as a screen and to poke and prod the advancing Macedonian monster. Behind them stood the heart of his army, the Roman legions. But they weren't in a solid line. They were arranged in their distinctive maniples, the checkerboard formation that was the secret to their success. Each legion was a collection of small, independent blocks of men. The green hastati in the first line, the veteran principes in the second, and the grizzled triarii in the third. This structure allowed the army to be porous. It could swirl, pivot, or step aside. Men could fall back through the gaps to regroup, or reserves could surge forward to plug a hole. It was a system designed for chaos, and Paulus was counting on chaos to be his greatest weapon. The stage was set. The two greatest military systems of the ancient world were about to collide. Chapter 5. Contact. The battle began with a sound, a low rumble that grew into a thunderous roll as the entire Macedonian line began to advance. It was a terrifying spectacle. The phalangites moved forward in perfect unison, a slow, inexorable shuffle that shook the ground. On command, the first 5 ranks of pikes dropped to the horizontal, creating a dense hedge of spear points. The rear ranks angled their sarissas overhead, forming a literal iron roof that could deflect incoming arrows and javelins. Paulus's allied skirmishers did their job, running forward to fling javelins and stones at the approaching wall, trying to disrupt its cohesion. But their light weapons glanced harmlessly off the shields and the angled pikes. The wall just kept coming, an unstoppable force of nature. Under this immense pressure, one wing of the allied Greek infantry cracked, then the other. They broke and fled back toward the main Roman line. For a single horrifying heartbeat, it smelled like Cannae 2.0. A wave of panicked, retreating troops flooding back into the legions, threatening to sow chaos and break their formation before the real fight even began. This was the moment that broke lesser commanders. But Paulus was not a lesser commander. Riding along the front line, his face a mask of calm authority, he was the picture of control. He had drilled for this. Instead of becoming a solid, brittle dam that would shatter under the impact of the retreat, the legions acted as they were designed. Centurions barked orders and the maniples opened their lanes. The retreating troops were funneled through the gaps in the checkerboard, like revolving doors, not a solid wall. They passed through the Roman line and were reformed in the rear. The phalanx, seeing the allies break, let out a triumphant roar and surged forward, sensing victory. They slammed into the front ranks of the legions. The Roman hastati braced, their large scutum shields absorbing the initial brutal impact. And then, with the chaos perfectly managed and the enemy fully committed, Paulus dropped the quiet, simple order that would flip the course of history. The command to the centurions of the maniples, waiting for this exact moment. Close the lanes. Chapter 6. The gaps open. Here is the dirty little secret about the Macedonian phalanx and its iconic sarissa. It was a weapon of astonishing power, a system perfected over 2 centuries, brilliant right up until the moment it wasn't. On a perfectly polished marble floor, it was an impregnable fortress. But on the lumpy, broken ground of Pydna, that 5-meter pike became a 5-meter lever that snagged on every rock, vine, and ancient tombstone. As the phalanx surged forward with triumphant momentum, its perfect cohesion began to fray. The uneven terrain did what no enemy had been able to do. Some files of men, finding clear ground, sprinted ahead. Others, stumbling into gullies or getting their pikes tangled in vineyard posts, lagged behind. Tiny cracks began to open in the monolithic wall of shields and spears. First inches, then feet, then yards. Paulus had seen this. He had anticipated it. He had drilled his men for this exact eventuality. As the gaps appeared, Roman centurions, the hardened NCOs of the legions, identified them and screamed their orders. Small groups of legionaries in wedge formations didn't try to break the pike wall. They dove under it. Ducking below the hedge of lethal points, they entered the space where the long pikes were useless, where the Macedonian phalangite had only a small dagger and a tiny shield. Once inside, it was no longer a battle. It was a butchery. The legionaries went to work with the gladius, the short, brutally efficient Spanish thrusting sword that was the Roman soldier's best friend. It was the perfect tool for this close, ugly work. They hacked at the wooden shafts of the sarissas, rendering them useless. They stabbed at the exposed, unarmored right arms and armpits of the phalangites. They used their large, heavy shields as weapons, slamming them into faces to create space before delivering a fatal thrust to the gut or throat. It was a meat grinder. The Macedonians were trapped. Their comrades in the rear ranks, blind to the horror unfolding at the front, kept pushing forward, following their training. This pressure from behind compacted their own front ranks, pinning them in place and turning them into a helpless, compressed kill zone. A phalangite couldn't swing his dagger, couldn't turn, couldn't run. All he could do was die as the disciplined, ruthless legionaries exploited every seam, turning the world's most formidable offensive formation into a death trap. Chapter 7. The Rout. What had been a contest of formations just minutes before now shattered like cheap pottery. The Macedonian front line disintegrated into pockets of desperate, bloody chaos. The psychological shockwave rippled back through the ranks. Phalangites, seeing the slaughter ahead and the Romans appearing in their midst, understood the battle was lost. They did the only thing they could. They dropped their heavy, cumbersome pikes and sprinted. Perseus, watching from his command post, saw his invincible infantry collapsing. He desperately tried to wheel his elite cavalry around to plug the hemorrhaging gaps in his center. But it was too late. Unit cohesion was gone. The rout had begun. Captains were screaming conflicting orders, royal standards were tilting and falling, and the entire army was dissolving into a panicked mob. This was the moment of Paulus's checkmate. With the Macedonian center in tatters, he unleashed his own cavalry, which he had held in reserve. They executed a sweeping hook, smashing into the now exposed Macedonian flank, just as the legions finally punched all the way through the center of the phalanx. The blow was decisive. The Macedonian army ceased to exist as a fighting force and became merely a collection of terrified men running for their lives. Perseus, deciding that the optics of a king's survival mattered more than a futile last stand, gathered his personal guard and galloped off the field, abandoning his army to its fate. The rest was butchery. The main fight had lasted less than an hour. The slaughter would last all afternoon. The disciplined Romans pursued relentlessly. Roman historical sources swear the chase ran for 14 miles down the road south. Modern archaeologists, excavating along the path of that ancient road, still find evidence of the desperate flight. Caches of melted silver coins, hastily buried by fleeing soldiers who would never return to claim them. By sunset, the plain was a carpet of bodies. As many as 25,000 Macedonians were dead. Another 10,000 or more were captured, destined to wake up in Roman slave pens. The kingdom of Macedon had lost its army in a single afternoon. Chapter 8. Aftermath. The kingdom ends. Pydna wasn't just a military loss for Macedon, it was a complete system crash. The kingdom's power, prestige, and future were annihilated in the space of a few hours. Perseus himself was captured within days, hunted down on the sacred island of Samothrace. He was brought before Paulus, a broken man. The Roman general, in a gesture that highlighted his complex character, reportedly treated the fallen king with a degree of respect, quoting Homer on the fickle nature of fortune, even as he was securing the chains for his prize. The ultimate destination for Perseus was Rome, where he would serve as the ultimate souvenir, the star attraction in Paulus's magnificent triumph. A Roman triumph was the highest honor a general could receive, a massive, spectacular parade through the city to celebrate a great victory. Paulus's was one of the most lavish Rome had ever seen, lasting 3 days. It featured floats laden with captured Macedonian armor and treasure, a display of the immense wealth now flowing into Rome's coffers. And on the final day came the climax. Perseus, along with his young children, forced to walk in chains before Paulus's chariot, a living symbol of a dead kingdom for the cheering Roman crowds to gawk at. Following the parade, Macedon's monarchy was formally deleted from the map. The Antigonid dynasty, which had ruled since the death of Alexander, was terminated. But Rome, ever the pragmatic overlord, didn't annex the territory directly just yet. Instead, Paulus, acting on the Senate's instructions, implemented a chillingly effective strategy: divide, impoverish, and control. Macedon was sliced into 4 separate republics. These new states were forbidden by law from trading or intermarrying with one another. Their political and economic ties were severed, making any unified resistance impossible. Rome had effectively broken the country's spine. The rest of Greece, which had long played the diplomatic tennis ball between larger powers, was now glued permanently to Rome's orbit. The Hellenistic age, the era of glittering successor kingdoms that had begun with Alexander's conquests, didn't just fade away. It ended abruptly with the clatter of thousands of pikes being dropped on a dusty plain in northern Greece. Chapter 9. The man behind the myth. Paulus himself emerges from the story as a figure of fascinating complexity, a perfect embodiment of the mid-Roman Republic. He was not just a battlefield technician. Following the victory, acting on direct orders from the vindictive Senate, he oversaw the brutal sacking of 70 towns in the region of Epirus, a region that had sympathized with Perseus. 150,000 people were enslaved in a single, hyper-efficient operation, a display of icy cruelty that stands in stark contrast to his scholarly pursuits. Because at the same time he was carrying out this brutal punishment, Paulus also took possession of Perseus's magnificent royal library. Instead of treating it as simple plunder, he had it carefully boxed up and shipped back to his home in Rome. It became the first major private library in the city, and his act sparked a craze for Greek books and learning among the Roman elite, profoundly shaping Roman culture for centuries to come. He was both a ruthless butcher and a man of high culture. His personal life was marked by Roman tradition and tragedy. His two older sons had been adopted out to other prominent families to secure political alliances, a common practice among the aristocracy. One became a Fabius, and the other was adopted by the son of Scipio Africanus, becoming the legendary Scipio Aemilianus. This was the same Scipio who would later command the Roman army that erased Carthage from the map in 146 BCE and destroy the city of Numantia in Spain. The family curse of Cannae wasn't just broken, it was eradicated and replaced with a legacy of conquest. Paulus's two younger sons, his natural heirs, tragically died shortly before and after his triumph, leaving him without a direct heir to carry on his name. But when Lucius Aemilius Paulus rolled through the streets of Rome in his triumphal chariot, the crowd wasn't thinking about his personal tragedies or the nuances of his character. They didn't see the ghost of Cannae's failure. They saw the man who had avenged that defeat. They saw the commander who had solved the Macedonian problem once and for all. They saw the general who parked a Roman Empire east of the Adriatic. Chapter 10. Why Pydna Still Matters. Military histories are stuffed with clever maneuvers and lopsided victories. But Pydna is a rare event, a single afternoon that triggers a hard reset of geopolitics for the next 500 years. The result of the battle was the definitive answer to the ancient world's longest-running military debate. The Phalanx, which had been king since Philip II and Alexander the Great, was retired on the spot. Its inflexibility had been fatally exposed. The Roman legion, flexible, modular, and built for uneven ground, became the new gold standard for military organization, a model that would dominate Europe and the Mediterranean for centuries. More importantly, the victory at Pydna fundamentally changed Rome's perception of itself and its place in the world. The Republic learned that it could floor a major Hellenistic kingdom, a successor to Alexander, before lunch. That newfound swagger, that imperial confidence carried forward into all its future dealings. It shaped the campaigns against Syria, the annexation of Greece, the protectorate over Egypt, and the long wars with Parthia. The eastern Mediterranean, the old heartland of Greek civilization, was on its way to becoming a Roman lake, and the loot, the incredible influx of grain, gold, art, slaves, and taxes flooded west into Italy. This tsunami of wealth would have dramatic and destabilizing consequences. It fueled the late Republic's boom, financing massive public works like the Colosseum decades later. But it also exacerbated the social tensions between the rich and poor, leading directly to the political upheavals of the Gracchi brothers, the social wars, and the rise of the warlords like Marius, Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar. Without the bonanza that Pydna unlocked, there's no Caesar paying off his enormous debts with gold from Gaul, and no imperial treasury fat enough to sustain the emperors. One hot hour in June sent ripples of consequence that would last for 1,000 years. So the next time someone insists that the story of Rome is all about roads, aqueducts, and law, remind them of Lucius Aemilius Paulus. Remind them of the kid haunted by the ghost of Cannae. Remind them of the stern, 60-year-old general who baited a powerful king off his mountain stronghold and onto broken ground. Remind them of the commander who saw the tiny cracks in a perfect system and, with a single order, deleted an entire kingdom before lunchtime. One battle, one call to exploit a gap no wider than a doorway, and the entire ancient world tilts on its axis. Pydna is the ultimate proof that history doesn't always crawl forward. Sometimes it pivots. It pivots on the courage of a few soldiers, on the vision of one commander, and on a single violent afternoon when a short Roman gladius met a long Macedonian pike, and the pike snapped. Did you enjoy watching Rome flip the entire geopolitical board in a single afternoon? Hit that subscribe button for more deep dives into the footnotes of history that turned into edge-of-your-seat thrillers. And let us know in the comments, which ancient underdog or overconfident titan deserves the spotlight next?